means of transmission with names of known people on them. And then they compiled huge biographical dictionaries to identify who all these people were in the history of Islam. And then they decided if they were good or bad Muslims. That is, if they were bad Muslims, like it was someone like Abu Sufyan who's a bad Muslim, or some other folks that they didn't think was a reliable person, they rejected the hadith. Well, here's what Schacht and others say. Well, those are just the ones that probably shouldn't reject. Because if you were going to forge a hadith, which a lot of these are probably what we would now call forged, you wouldn't give it a bad isnad. In fact, if it had a bad isnad, in other words, if the transmission wasn't very, what you would call kosher, or didn't have the appearance of, didn't have what you would consider a good appearance, well, that would probably imply that it wasn't forged, because nobody was forging something would give it a bad isnad. You see, only the people who wanted the thing to look hunky-dory would give it the perfect isnad, so no one would reject it. It's like going to a courtroom and, giving your testimony there and making sure everything is like all cleaned up and nice and consistent. And then someone comes in who's inconsistent and says, oh, well, he's consistent. He isn't. No. If the guy comes in inconsistent, it means he hasn't prettied it out. So just what they were using to reject things may have been the thing that you shouldn't have rejected them on. And that's their criticism. That's their criticism. It's not based on the content or anything like that. It's just based on were the people who transmitted it, according to the biographical dictionaries, good Muslims. Well, Western scholars think that's an absurd form of criticism. It's not, it isn't criticism. It's like saying the Gospels, John, Mark, you see, it's very like the Gospels. This is the Gospel according to John. This is the Gospel according to Mark. Are John, Mark, Matthew, and Luke reliable witnesses? You see? And who knows if they're reliable witnesses? Oh, they're good Christians. That's it. They're reliable witnesses. And so whatever they say is okay. No, that's not the way. That's not sufficient to evaluate whether the Gospels are reliable or not. Just because they're put in the name of John or Mark or one of the other apostles or disciples that may not have even made them in the first place. So that's the weakness of Muslim hadith criticism, and that's what our friend Mr. Said is calling Western Orientalism. And this is nonsense what they're saying, and it's deceptive to the average person. It's an attack on strong intellectual standards is what it is, and it's very, I can't attack it myself enough, because I've seen Western Orientalists, and they're the most impressive, serious-minded people in any subject I've ever had the pleasure of being part of. And I just resent it personally. So does my colleague who trained under Western Orientalists up in McGill University. She's did French, mostly French Orientalists, but all of them are terribly serious and painstakingly careful people. Nothing like the field I'm in now, Dead Sea Scroll studies and Christian sort of text criticism and so on, nothing like that. The Islamic thing was always done on the highest level by Western scholars. I just object to this silly labeling them Orientalists and then throwing their work away. That's just ridiculous. So anyway, you'll have to decide that for yourself. I've already told you where I stand on that issue. I think that they are right to question these things. I don't think that the Hadith tell you anything particularly about the Prophet or not, and they may or they may not, but it needs a different kind of evaluation. Anyway, that being said, the practice and opinion of the legal schools, according to Schacht, got into the Hadith. So ultimately, out of all this, 4 legal schools emerged, as I told you. The school in Iraq were called the Hanafis after the scholar Abu Hanifa around 760 or 770 or something like that. Malik is around 760, he's in Medina. Hanbal is in Baghdad, he's much more conservative, he's around 850. Shafi is about 800 and he ends up in Egypt, even though he started out in Iran. These people all wrote legal textbooks, and the legal textbook that they wrote became the focus of the different schools. Now, the closing of the gate of Ijtihad says that only these great legal scholars have a right to exercise their opinion. Once it was put in the final form that they arrived at, no one after that had the right to exercise his or her opinion. So Islamic law in all these four areas became totally frozen, like a fossil, and didn't change for 1,000 years. It just became concretized and still is there. It's like fundamentalist Christianity or Judaism, which is why Islam cannot come out of the Middle Ages. You can't upgrade women's rights. You can't do anything because of this frozen situation. And they want to open the door of Ijtihad from the 19th century to the 20th century. And now there's a reaction. The bin Laden lunatic fringe people are now threatening everyone, and they're going back to the more conservative position. So who knows what the next century will bring. That's what the struggle in Iraq is all about, which is why I think the struggle in Iraq is good, and that the threateners, the bully boys, the people who want to frighten people, cow people into conformity, should be defeated, even if it takes a Western army to help the people do it, because that's the only way you're going to get an opening of the gate of Ijtihad and a modernization. And the people fighting that battle know that that's the case, and therefore they don't want the Western armies in there. They don't want the gate of Ijtihad to come open. They don't want the societies to change. They don't want them to be modernized. I mean, I can put the whole struggle in a nutshell for you. The newspapers can't do it, but it's very simple, and I've just given it to you in a nutshell. This is what it's all about. The bin Laden and all the other types don't want the thing to unfreeze. They want to go back to the classical period. They want to go back to medieval Islam. You started to get what was called Islamic modernism at the end of the 1800s, into the early 1900s in Egypt and other countries. And now they want to turn back that clock. And they do it through brute force, through threatening people, through all kinds of horrible sort of threats, even cutting people's throats and stuff like that. And if you're there, you're not going to speak up, I can assure you. If you're living in these countries where you can have your throat cut or your wife can be raped or something like that, you're not going to speak up. Unless you're an extremely brave man. They had some interviews about what happened to women in Egypt who were trying to speak, and they had that on CNN just last night. I listened to it. It was horrible to hear their testimony, how they were beat up and brutalized on the streets in Egypt, and that's a modern Islamic country. It's a kind of frightening struggle. And